March 17, 1944. A small office on the third floor of Wehrmacht headquarters, Budapest. Major Klaus von Steinbach sat alone at his desk, staring at a single sheet of paper that had arrived by courier 20 minutes earlier. The afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating dust particles that drifted through the air like ash. Outside, the city continued its uneasy routine. Trams rattling down boulevards, cafes serving coffee that tasted more of chicory than beans, people moving through their days pretending not to notice the increasing presence of German troops. The document before him was typed on standard military letterhead. Official stamps. Proper signatures. Everything correct and legal according to the regulations he had sworn to uphold. It was an order for the immediate deportation of 12,000 Hungarian Jews from the city's outskirts, scheduled to begin in 72 hours. His signature was required at the bottom. Von Steinbach was 43 years old. A career officer from an old Prussian family that had served Germany for generations. His father had fought in the Franco-Prussian War. His grandfather had commanded artillery at Königgrätz. The family estate near Potsdam displayed portraits of ancestors in uniform stretching back to Frederick the Great. Duty, honor, obedience, these were not abstract concepts but the foundation of everything he had been raised to believe. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1925, when the military still carried the tarnished dignity of defeat, when officers wore civilian clothes to avoid harassment, when the treaty restrictions seemed designed to humiliate rather than ensure peace. He had watched Germany rebuild its military strength, had welcomed the restoration of national pride, had believed, genuinely believed, that his country had been wronged by Versailles and deserved its place among great powers. By 1944 he commanded the Logistics Coordination Office for occupied Hungary. Not a combat position. Not glamorous. But necessary. His job was to manage the movement of supplies, equipment and personnel. To ensure that orders were executed efficiently. To maintain the precise records and transportation schedules that kept military operations functioning. He was good at it. Methodical, careful, reliable. The kind of officer who made the machinery work. The order on his desk represented exactly the kind of task his office handled regularly. Transportation logistics. Scheduling. Coordination with railway authorities. Documentation. On paper, it differed little from 100 other movement orders he had processed. So many trains to be assembled. So many carriages required. Such and such departure times. Arrival at designated locations. Except this wasn't about moving military supplies or reinforcements. He picked up the document and read it again, slowly this time, forcing himself to absorb every word. The language was bureaucratic, sanitized. Resettlement. Processing. Labor allocation. Euphemisms carefully chosen to obscure what was actually being described. But von Steinbach had been in Hungary long enough to understand what these words meant. He had heard the rumors. Seen the reports that circulated among senior officers. Knew what happened to the trains that departed eastward and returned empty. The Jewish quarter in Budapest had been cordoned off 2 weeks earlier. Yellow stars had been mandatory since March. The new Hungarian government, installed after Germany occupied the country, had proven enthusiastically compliant with Berlin's directives regarding what they called the Jewish question. Now the machinery of deportation was being set in motion, and von Steinbach's office sat at a crucial junction in that machinery. Without his signature, the order could not be processed. Without his coordination, the trains would not be scheduled. Without the documentation his office produced, the entire operation would stall. One officer refusing to sign might not stop the machine entirely. Someone else would eventually be found, another signature obtained. But it would cause delay, disruption, questions. He placed the document face down on his desk and stood, walking to the window. Budapest spread before him, the Danube cutting through the city like a gray artery. Beautiful even in occupation. He had grown fond of this city during his posting. The architecture. The cafes. The way music seemed to drift from buildings at unexpected hours. Somewhere out there, in the cordoned streets of the Jewish quarter, 12,000 people were going about their lives in the narrowing space permitted to them. Mothers preparing dinner with whatever food remained available. Children doing homework. Old men saying prayers. People who had lived in this city for generations, whose families had been Hungarian as long as Hungary existed. Now designated for resettlement, by an order requiring his signature. Von Steinbach had never considered himself a political man. He had joined the military to serve Germany, not to serve a party. When the Nazis came to power, he had accepted it as a civilian matter, something outside his professional concern. When the racial laws were enacted, he had told himself these were policy decisions for politicians to debate. His duty was to follow orders, to maintain discipline, to uphold the military tradition of obedience regardless of who held political power. But standing at that window, staring out at a city that would soon lose 12,000 of its residents to destinations he could not allow himself to imagine, something inside him refused to move forward. He returned to his desk and opened the locked drawer where sensitive documents were stored. The deportation order went inside, beneath routine requisition forms and supply manifests. He closed the drawer, locked it, sat back in his chair and stared at the key in his hand. This wasn't a decision. Not yet. This was simply postponement. He needed time to think, to consider his options, to understand what he was contemplating. Because by hiding that order, even temporarily, Major Klaus von Steinbach was crossing a line that Prussian officers did not cross. He was placing his personal judgment above official directives. He was asserting that there were orders a man should not obey, no matter what his training demanded. He was becoming something his family tradition had no category for, a soldier in rebellion against his own command structure. The afternoon light shifted. The office grew dimmer. Von Steinbach sat motionless at his desk, one hand still holding the key to a drawer that now contained an order he could not bring himself to execute, an order that would not disappear simply because he refused to acknowledge it. Outside, Budapest continued its occupied routine. Inside that third-floor office, an officer trained in obedience had just taken his first step toward something that would define the rest of his life. He would have 72 hours before someone noticed the delay. 72 hours to decide whether he was making a terrible mistake or performing the only honorable action available to him. 72 hours to choose between the duty he had sworn to uphold and the conscience he had spent his entire military career learning to suppress. The document remained in the locked drawer. Budapest remained unaware. And Major Klaus von Steinbach remained at his desk, trying to understand what he had just done and what it would cost him. The call came on the morning of the third day. Von Steinbach had spent 72 hours moving through a careful routine. He arrived at his office at the usual hour, processed the usual paperwork, attended the usual meetings, spoke to subordinates in his usual measured tone. Everything normal, everything correct. While the deportation order remained locked in his drawer, untouched, unprocessed, unacknowledged. Major von Steinbach, Colonel Richter wishes to see you immediately. He placed the telephone receiver back in its cradle with steady hands. 3 days. He had bought 3 days and now the reckoning had arrived. He stood, buttoned his uniform jacket, and walked down the corridor to the colonel's office with the same precise gait he had maintained throughout his career. Colonel Richter was not a cruel man. Not in the conventional sense. He was efficient, professional, committed to following procedures and ensuring that orders flowed smoothly down the chain of command. He looked up when von Steinbach entered, and his expression showed more confusion than anger. Klaus, I've received an inquiry from Berlin regarding transport scheduling for Operation Margaretti Phase 7. They show your office as the coordination point, but there's no documentation in the system. No train requisitions. No movement orders. Nothing. Von Steinbach stood at attention. I'm aware, sir. Richter's confusion deepened. You're aware? Then where is the paperwork? This operation was scheduled to begin yesterday. The order is in my office, sir. I have not yet processed it. A long silence filled the space between them. Richter set down the file he had been holding. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note von Steinbach had never heard from him before, genuine bewilderment. You received a direct order from Berlin and did not process it? Yes, sir. Why not? And here it was. The moment when von Steinbach would have to speak aloud what he had only thought in the privacy of his office. The moment when postponement became decision, when passive resistance became active refusal. Because the order is illegal, sir? Richter blinked. Illegal? The order comes from Berlin, carries proper authorization, follows established procedures. It violates international law, sir. The Hague Conventions. The treatment of civilian populations in occupied territory. We cannot claim these people are legitimate military threats. They are being targeted for removal based solely on their ethnic identity. That makes the order illegal. Richter stood now, his confusion giving way to something closer to concern. Klaus, are you aware of what you're saying? You're not a lawyer. Neither am I. Our job is not to evaluate the legality of orders from higher command. Our job is to execute them. My oath was to serve Germany, sir. Not to participate in crimes. The word hung in the air between them. Crimes. It was the first time von Steinbach had said it aloud, and hearing it in his own voice made it real in a way it hadn't been before. He watched Richter's face change, watched the colonel recognize that this conversation had moved beyond a simple administrative delay into far more dangerous territory. Major von Steinbach, I'm going to give you a direct order. Return to your office. Process the transport documentation. Have it on my desk by 1400 hours. Is that clear? Sir, I cannot comply with that order. Richter's voice hardened. Cannot or will not? Will not, sir. Another silence. Richter walked to the window, the same view von Steinbach had stared at 3 days earlier. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. More careful. More cautious. Do you understand what happens if you refuse a direct order? Do you understand the consequences? I do, sir. Court-martial. Possibly execution. At minimum, dismissal from service and disgrace. Your family's name, your entire military tradition. Everything you've worked for, everything you represent, destroyed. I understand, sir. Richter turned from the window. Then why? Klaus, I've known you for 8 years. You're a good officer. Conscientious. Reliable. This isn't like you. What's changed? Von Steinbach met his colonel's eyes. Nothing has changed, sir. Or perhaps everything has. I joined the Wehrmacht to serve Germany. I believed in duty, in honor, in obedience to legitimate authority. But somewhere along the way those concepts became twisted. Obedience stopped meaning service to our country and started meaning participation in things I can no longer pretend not to understand. You're talking about treason. No, sir. I'm talking about the exact opposite. I'm trying to remain loyal to what Germany should be, not what it has become. Richter sat back down, suddenly looking much older. You won't be able to stop it, you know. If you refuse, they'll simply assign the task to someone else. Another officer will process the order. The trains will roll. Nothing will change except your own destruction. I know that, sir. But I will not be the one to sign it. I will not be the one whose coordination makes it possible. If this is going to happen, they will have to find someone else to make the machinery work. I will not participate. The colonel studied him for a long moment. Then quietly, I could have you arrested right now. Placed in custody. The order processed by someone else while you await trial. Yes, sir. Is that what you want? What I want, sir, doesn't seem particularly relevant anymore. Richter stood and walked to his desk but didn't sit. He seemed to be considering something, weighing options. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 24 hours. Von Steinbach looked at him. Sir? I'm giving you 24 hours to reconsider, to think about your family, your career, everything you'll be throwing away. Tomorrow at this time I will ask you again if you will process that order. And if your answer is still no. He didn't finish the sentence. I appreciate the consideration, sir, but my answer will not change. Take the 24 hours anyway, Klaus. That's an order you can follow. Von Steinbach saluted, turned, and left the colonel's office. Walking back down the corridor, he felt strangely calm. The decision had been made. Spoken aloud. There was no going back now. But Richter had given him something unexpected. Time. Not time to change his mind, but time for something else. An idea had begun forming during their conversation. Something that might matter more than his own gesture of refusal. Back in his office, von Steinbach unlocked the drawer and removed the deportation order. He studied it carefully, noting every detail. The train schedules. The coordination requirements. The bureaucratic machinery that had to align perfectly for the operation to proceed smoothly. Then he began making telephone calls. His first call was to Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, a junior officer in the railway administration whom he had worked with on numerous logistics operations. Hoffmann answered with his usual cheerful efficiency. Werner, I need a favor. Personal, not official. Can you slow down the requisition processing for any unusual transport requests you receive in the next week? Nothing that would cause suspicion, just administrative delays, paperwork that needs to be resubmitted, forms that get misfiled. There was a pause. Major, is this about the operation everyone's been whispering about? I can't discuss that. I'm simply asking if standard bureaucratic inefficiency might happen to affect certain requests. Another pause. Then very carefully, bureaucracy is often inefficient, sir. Forms do get misfiled. These things happen. Thank you, Werner. His second call was to Captain Ernst Müller, who coordinated housing and facilities. The conversation followed a similar pattern. Von Steinbach making a request that was never quite stated directly, Müller understanding what was being asked without anything being explicitly said. By the end of the day, von Steinbach had made 11 phone calls. He had arranged for paperwork to be mysteriously delayed, for requisition forms to require unexpected resubmission, for schedules to encounter inexplicable complications. He couldn't stop the deportation order. Someone else would eventually sign it. But he could make the machinery work less efficiently. Could inject friction into the process. Could buy days, maybe weeks. Could save some number of lives he would never be able to count. That evening he returned to his quarters and wrote 2 letters. One to his father, explaining his decision and apologizing for the disgrace he was about to bring upon the family name. One to his sister, asking her to ensure their father understood that this was not a rejection of everything they had taught him, but an attempt to honor the deeper meaning behind those lessons. Duty to something higher than orders, honor that meant more than obedience. He sealed the letters and placed them in his desk drawer. Tomorrow he would face Richter again. Tomorrow the consequences would begin. But tonight, Major Klaus von Steinbach sat in his quarters and felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Not the peace of certainty about what would happen to him. Not the peace of knowing he would survive what was coming. But the peace of knowing that when the moment of choice arrived, he had not looked away. Outside, Budapest slept under occupation. Inside those quarters, an officer who had spent his entire life learning to follow orders had discovered something more important than obedience. He had discovered that there were lines a man could not cross, regardless of the cost of stopping. The arrest came at dawn. 2 military police officers arrived at von Steinbach's quarters at 6 in the morning, their faces expressionless as they delivered the formal notice. Major Klaus von Steinbach was to be taken into custody pending court-martial proceedings for refusal to obey lawful orders and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was permitted to collect a few personal items. Everything else would be sealed as evidence. He dressed in his uniform one final time, moving with the same methodical precision he had maintained throughout his career. When the MPs escorted him down the stairs and into the waiting vehicle, a few of his fellow officers watched from windows and doorways. Some looked away. Others met his eyes with expressions he couldn't quite read, shock perhaps or something more complex. The military detention facility occupied a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Budapest. Bare concrete walls. Small windows set too high to see out of. The cell where they placed him measured roughly 3 meters by 4, containing a narrow cot, a small desk and a single chair. Not cruel exactly. Just deliberately empty of comfort or distraction. For 3 days no one spoke to him except the guards who brought his meals. Von Steinbach spent the time reviewing everything he had done, testing his decision from every angle, searching for doubt and finding none. He had violated orders. He would face the consequences. That much was simple. What wasn't simple was the web of connections he had activated in those 11 phone calls. Junior officers throughout the logistics system who were now creating small delays, minor complications, bureaucratic tangles that would slow the machinery of deportation. Von Steinbach had no way of knowing if those delays were working, or for how long they might continue before someone noticed the pattern and shut them down. On the 4th day his cell door opened to reveal Colonel Richter, alone. The colonel waved away the guard and entered, closing the door behind him. For a long moment he simply stood there, studying von Steinbach with an expression that mixed disappointment with something else. "They want to make an example of you," Richter said finally. "Berlin has taken a personal interest. Your family name makes it worse. If a von Steinbach can refuse orders, what message does that send to younger officers with less distinguished lineages?" "I understand, sir. Do you?" Richter moved to the window, though it showed nothing but a patch of gray sky. "The prosecutor is arguing for execution. Treason in time of war. They have the documentation. Your refusal was witnessed, recorded, undeniable. The defense they've assigned you is competent but has been instructed not to challenge the fundamental facts, only to argue for leniency. Have they processed the deportation order?" Richter turned. "That's what you want to know. Not about your own fate. Has someone else signed it?" The colonel was quiet for a moment. "Captain Schneider took over your duties. He signed the order 2 days ago. The operation is proceeding." Von Steinbach nodded slowly. He had bought 5 days total. Whatever those delays he had set in motion might accomplish, that was the entirety of his impact. 5 days. "How many trains?" he asked. "I'm not going to discuss operational details with a prisoner facing court-martial." "Please, sir. I just need to know if the delays made any difference." Richter studied him then sighed. "The first transport left yesterday. 1,200 people. The second is scheduled for tomorrow. But there have been complications. Paperwork issues. Scheduling conflicts. The operation is running behind the original timeline." Something flickered in von Steinbach's chest. Behind timeline. His network of small sabotages was functioning. "For now. There's something you should know," Richter continued, his voice lower now. "Your actions have created waves you probably didn't anticipate. Some of the junior officers are asking questions. Why would a career officer with an impeccable record refuse orders unless something was fundamentally wrong with those orders? It's creating doubt. Hesitation. Not open rebellion, no one else has refused, but a kind of moral uncertainty that makes the machinery run less smoothly." "Good," von Steinbach said quietly. "Good. Klaus, they're going to execute you for this. Probably by firing squad. The trial is a formality, the verdict has already been decided. Your family will be destroyed by association. Every connection you've ever had will be tainted. And you say good, because you've created doubt in a few junior officers." Von Steinbach met his colonel's eyes. "Yes, sir. Because if even one of those officers thinks twice before signing the next order, if even one of them creates one more delay, if even one more person escapes because the machinery didn't run smoothly enough, then yes. Good." Richter shook his head, but von Steinbach couldn't tell if it was in anger or grudging respect. "The trial is set for 3 weeks from now. If you want me to deliver any messages to your family, I'll see that they're sent." "I've already written to them." "Thank you, sir." The colonel moved toward the door then paused. Without turning around he spoke again. "There's a rabbi in Budapest. Rabbi Wise. He's been helping coordinate hiding places for people trying to avoid deportation. Some of the people who should have been on that first transport weren't found when the roundup occurred. The search teams reported addresses that turned up empty. People warned in advance." Von Steinbach's breath caught. "How?" I don't know. Someone has been passing information. Warning the Jewish Council about raids before they happen. Giving them hours, sometimes only minutes, to disappear. Now Richter did turn. I'm not saying this is connected to anything you did. I'm not saying those 11 phone calls you made went to people who might have contacts outside official channels. I'm simply telling you that people who should be on trains right now are instead in hiding. And the number keeps growing. The two men looked at each other across the cell. Understanding passed between them without words. Sir, von Steinbach said carefully, if there is such a network, if people are being warned. I don't want to know the details, Richter cut him off. I don't want to know who's involved or how it works. I'm telling you this for one reason only. You asked if your delay made any difference. I thought you deserved an answer. He knocked on the door. The guard opened it and Richter walked out without looking back. Von Steinbach sat on the edge of his cot, processing what he had just learned. His refusal had bought 5 days. But those 5 days, combined with the network of delays he had set in motion, had created a window. And someone, rabbi-wise, others he would never know, had used that window to save lives. How many? He would probably never know. Hundreds? Thousands? Or just a few dozen who happened to be in the right place at the right time, warned by someone who knew someone in the chain of small acts of resistance von Steinbach had initiated. He stood and walked to the high window, gripping the bars. Outside, Budapest continued its occupied existence. Somewhere in that city, people who should be on trains were instead hiding in attics, basements, safe houses arranged by networks he had helped make possible without ever intending to. The trial would come. The verdict was already decided. But lying awake in his cell that night, Major Klaus von Steinbach understood something that would sustain him through whatever came next. He had been taught that an officer's duty was to follow orders without question. That obedience was the foundation of military honor. That individual conscience had no place in the chain of command. He had spent his entire career believing those lessons. But in choosing to hide his own orders, in refusing to make the machinery work, he had discovered a deeper truth. Sometimes the most honorable thing an officer can do is refuse to obey. And sometimes one man's refusal, amplified through others willing to create small delays and bureaucratic tangles, could give Rabbi Wise and his network the hours they needed to move people into hiding. 1 signature withheld. 11 phone calls made. 5 days bought. And lives saved that would never appear in any official record. It was enough. It had to be enough. Outside his cell, the guards changed shifts. Inside, a condemned officer slept more soundly than he had in months. The court-martial took place on a wet April morning in a requisition government building that still smelled of plaster dust and fresh paint. 3 senior officers sat in judgment, a colonel, a brigadier, and a general whom von Steinbach had never met. The proceedings lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. The prosecution presented their case with crisp efficiency. The order. The refusal. The witnessed confirmation of that refusal. The documentation trail. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. Major Klaus von Steinbach had received a lawful order from higher command and deliberately refused to execute it. The facts were not in dispute. The defense attorney, a Captain Brandt who had been assigned to the case rather than chosen, made what arguments he could. Von Steinbach's distinguished service record. His family's military tradition. The absence of any prior disciplinary issues. He carefully avoided arguing that the refusal itself was justified. To suggest that the order was illegal would be to question the authority of higher command, which would likely result in Brandt facing his own court-martial. Von Steinbach sat through it all in silence. He had been asked if he wished to testify in his own defense and declined. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make the verdict worse for everyone involved. The deliberation lasted 23 minutes. Guilty on all charges. Sentenced to death by firing squad. Execution to be carried out within 7 days. Family property to be confiscated. Military honors stripped. Name to be struck from all official records. Von Steinbach stood at attention as the sentence was read, his face showing nothing. He had known this was coming from the moment he hid that first order. There were no surprises here. What surprised him came 3 days later, when Colonel Richter visited his cell again. Your sentence has been modified, Richter said, the word clearly chosen with care. The execution order has been suspended indefinitely. Instead, you're being transferred to a penal battalion on the Eastern Front. Immediate deployment. Von Steinbach stared at him. I don't understand. Who authorized this? I don't know. The order came from Berlin, but it doesn't match the usual chain of command. Someone with significant authority intervened. Richter lowered his voice. There are rumors about your case circulating at higher levels. Questions about whether making a public example of a von Steinbach for refusing deportation orders might create the wrong kind of attention. Better to send you somewhere you'll probably die anyway, but without the publicity of an execution. The Eastern Front. A penal battalion. They have a life expectancy measured in weeks, sometimes days. You won't survive the summer. But you also won't be shot in front of a firing squad, and your family won't have to live with that specific shame. Von Steinbach absorbed this. A slower death instead of a quick one. A remote battlefield instead of a public execution. It changed the timeline but not the ending. When do I leave? Tomorrow morning. There's something else you should know before you go. Richter pulled an envelope from his jacket and handed it through the bars. This arrived at my office yesterday. No return address. Just your name on the front. Von Steinbach opened it carefully. Inside was a single page with 3 sentences written in an elegant hand. Because of the delays, 847 people escaped the first transport. They are alive because you bought them time. That number will grow. No signature. No name. But von Steinbach knew it must have come from someone connected to Rabbi Wise's network. 847 people. He read the number again, letting it settle into his consciousness. 847 lives that would have been lost if the machinery had run smoothly, if he had signed that order when it first arrived, if those 11 phone calls had never been made. Klaus, Richter said quietly, I don't know what that letter means and I don't want to know. But I thought you should have it before you left. Von Steinbach folded the paper carefully and placed it in his pocket. Thank you, sir. For everything. The colonel nodded and turned to go, then paused at the cell door. You know, they teach us that obedience is the foundation of military discipline. That individual conscience is a luxury soldiers cannot afford. That the chain of command exists precisely to prevent officers from making personal judgments about orders. Yes, sir. They do teach that. Maybe they're wrong. Richter's voice was barely audible. Maybe sometimes an officer serves his country best by refusing to obey. He left without waiting for a response. The next morning von Steinbach was transferred to a military convoy heading east. The journey took 11 days through territories that showed the advancing tide of destruction. Bombed out cities, burned villages, columns of refugees moving in both directions. By the time they reached the Eastern Front, spring had turned the landscape into an ocean of mud. The penal battalion he joined consisted of men who had committed various military offenses. Desertion, insubordination, theft, refusal of orders. They were given the most dangerous assignments, the positions no regular units wanted. Mine-clearing operations. Forward reconnaissance into areas likely to be under fire. Assaults on fortified positions with minimal support. It was punishment disguised as military service. A slow execution by attrition. Von Steinbach survived 6 weeks. He died on June 3, 1944, during a Soviet artillery barrage that caught his unit in an exposed position. He was helping pull a wounded soldier to cover when the shell landed close enough that both men were killed instantly. The official notification to his family listed him as killed in action. No mention of court-martial. No reference to refusal of orders. Just another officer who fell serving Germany in the East. His father received the notice at the family estate near Potsdam and spent the rest of that day sitting alone in the library, staring at the portraits of ancestors in uniform, trying to understand what his son had done and why. In Budapest, Rabbi Wise and his network continued their work. The delays von Steinbach had set in motion had cascaded through the bureaucratic system, creating windows of opportunity that were exploited by people who understood what those windows meant. By the end of 1944, when Soviet forces finally liberated Budapest, the network had helped hide or evacuate nearly 3,000 people who had been slated for deportation. Most of those survivors never knew that their escape had been made possible by a Wehrmacht major who refused to sign an order. They knew only that they had been warned in time, that they had found hiding places, that they had survived when so many others had not. After the war, von Steinbach's name appeared on no memorials. His family, tainted by association with the Nazi regime despite his final act of resistance, sold the estate near Potsdam and disappeared into the anonymity of post-war Germany. The military tradition that had defined them for generations ended with Klaus. But in 1961, Rabbi Wise testified at a war crimes trial in Jerusalem. When asked about resistance networks in Budapest, he mentioned, almost in passing, that they had received help from a German officer who refused to process deportation orders, who created delays that gave us time to act. The testimony was recorded but drew little attention at the time. It was one small detail in a massive historical record. 30 years later, a researcher studying the Budapest deportations found that testimony while reviewing trial transcripts. She tracked down more references, pieced together phone records, interviewed elderly survivors who remembered strange delays in the spring of 1944. Slowly, the story of Major Klaus von Steinbach emerged from historical obscurity. In 1989, a memorial plaque was installed at the site of the former Wehrmacht headquarters in Budapest. It commemorates those who resisted from within, whose courage saved lives even at the cost of their own. Von Steinbach's name appears third on the list. His father had died years earlier, never knowing that his son's disgrace would eventually be reframed as heroism. His sister, however, lived to see the memorial unveiled. She was 83 years old, standing in the rain outside a building her brother had worked in half a century earlier, reading his name on bronze. A reporter asked her what she thought Klaus would have said about being honored this way. She was quiet for a long moment, remembering the letters he had sent her from Budapest, the careful words he had chosen, the burden she could sense between the lines. "I think," she said finally, "he would say that 847 was not enough, that he should have acted sooner, that he wished he could have saved more." She touched the plaque gently. "But I also think he would be glad to know that his refusal mattered, that it saved someone." The lesson of Klaus von Steinbach's story is not that individual resistance can stop atrocities. It cannot. The machinery of deportation continued with or without his signature. The Holocaust proceeded. Millions died. But his story proves something else, that individual conscience matters even when it cannot prevent catastrophe. That one officer's refusal to participate can create ripples that save lives impossible to count. That sometimes the most important thing a person can do is refuse to make evil more efficient. In military academies today, von Steinbach's case is sometimes discussed in ethics courses. What is the duty of a soldier who believes an order is illegal? Where is the line between obedience and complicity? When is refusal an act of courage rather than cowardice? There are no easy answers. The military depends on discipline and order. The chain of command exists for crucial reasons. An army where every officer makes individual judgments about which orders to follow cannot function. Yet Klaus von Steinbach chose individual conscience over institutional obedience, and 847 people lived who would have died. That number, documented, verified, real, stands as his answer to those complex questions. On June 3 each year, a small ceremony takes place at the memorial in Budapest. Descendants of survivors gather to remember those who helped save their families. They light candles. They say prayers. They speak names. And they remember an officer who hid his own orders, who created delays in a machine designed to run efficiently, who bought hours that were used to save lives. They remember that resistance does not always look like armed rebellion or dramatic defiance. Sometimes it looks like bureaucratic delays, missing paperwork, schedules that don't quite align. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting at a desk, staring at an order he cannot bring himself to sign, choosing conscience over career, humanity over obedience. Klaus von Steinbach died in mud and chaos on the Eastern Front, far from his family's estate, stripped of his military honors, recorded in history as just another casualty of a war that consumed millions. But he died knowing he had refused to participate. He died with the knowledge that 847 people, fathers, mothers, children, elderly couples, young artists, students, shopkeepers, people with names and stories, were alive because he had chosen to hide his own orders. It was not enough to stop the Holocaust. Nothing one man could do would have been enough for that. But it was enough to matter. And in the end, that is what conscience demands. Not that we save everyone, but that we refuse to participate in their destruction. Not that we stop the machinery of evil, but that we refuse to make it run more smoothly. The lesson is not comfortable. It offers no easy formulas or clear guidelines. It suggests that duty and honor sometimes mean disobedience. That the most honorable thing an officer can do might be to fail in his assigned task. That there are orders that should not be followed, even when the consequences of refusal are severe. Klaus von Steinbach understood those consequences. He accepted them. He died for them. And 847 people lived. That is his legacy. Not the court-martial. Not the stripped honors. Not the unmarked grave in a landscape of mud and destruction. His legacy is measured in lives saved by delays he created, in the time he bought for WWII and his network, in the precedent he set for others who might face similar choices. His legacy is the question he forces us to ask. If the orders are wrong, if the machinery is evil, what is the duty of the officer who has the power to slow it down? He answered that question by hiding his own orders and accepting the price. The rest of us must answer it for ourselves.